Hello everyone and welcome to today's Mondac webinar in association with Long & Law Firm, where we will be presenting reforms of China's visa and residency permit regime against a backdrop of market access, technology development, economic recovery and national security. My name is Dan Sampaio and I'm joined by the brilliant Frank Hong to take us through today's discussion. Frank has over 20 years of legal experience in the ever-evolving field China-related cross-border transactions, regulatory compliance and dispute resolution. Frank's expertise spans a broad spectrum involving PE, VC investment, M&A deals, supply chain restructuring, formation and dissolutions of FIEs, and licensing resolving commercial and IP disputes. Frank's work often requires cross-cultural communications and creative problem solving under challenging circumstances. Well-versed in China's regulatory matters such as capital flow management, customs, data and privacy and corporate immigration, Frank regularly delivers lectures on complex issues before professional and academic audiences. Now, before I hand over to Frank to begin today's webinar, a housekeeping item. You can submit questions to Frank today by typing them into the questions pane of the toolbar on the right-hand side of your page. We will endeavour to answer as many questions as possible during our Q&A session, but please do reach out after the webinar for any additional information. It's now my pleasure to hand you over to Frank to begin. Thank you.
Dan, thank you very much. And of course, thanks to the team at Mondac. It's quite a privilege to have this opportunity to present this topic to audience worldwide. Actually, it's 10 p.m. in China, Shanghai. So good evening from Shanghai. I am aware of some of your audience are in the morning hours. So good morning to you if you are in the States. Well, as we heard from Dan's introduction, this is a topic on corporate immigration in China. And the timing is somewhat peculiar. As you see in the title, this is a reality check in China post-COVID. So there is a qualifying phrase to set us in the time framework that we are in today. Well, Aaron, next slide, please. So, well, typically when you do a presentation, you want to generate some fanfare. You want to present a upbeat image or environment. But unfortunately, the world as we are in today is in such a gloomy situation. So as you see on the slide, we don't have much good news. I don't need to read from top one to the final one, but I can share you with some of my personal observation. First, right now I'm in my office building. I can tell you, I don't have to look out of the window to check. I can tell you, we have taxi drivers waiting outside the building. Now, this is late hours, but you know, taxi drivers, if their business is good, they don't have to wait so late outside the building. But that's the reality. It's not just me that having notice of this situation. Some of my colleagues, you know, shared with me a few days ago that they noticed the taxi drivers are typically lining up outside buildings. This is not the case before 2019. So I can tell from this small vantage point, the economy is not back in pre-COVID yet. A few days ago, Chinese government issued statistics. Again, it's shocking. In my professional life, I have not heard data as bad as what we have learned a few days ago. So let me read this to you just to be accurate. Profits at industrial firms in China declined 23% in the first 2 months. So this is something I have never run into in my professional life. If you continue to read the data from the government, you'll see that foreign invested sectors in China declined by over 30%. So economy situation is not that great. Partly it's because of the COVID lockdown, which lasted 3 years. But on the other hand, the government and the private sector are taking measures to jumpstart the economy. So there, you will be able to see positive news. Just to name a few, for example, restaurants are fully booked. You have to make an advanced reservation nowadays. So that is a positive sign. But obviously today, I'm not going to go into details on those microeconomic situations. Aaron, next slide, please. So tonight, our focus is corporate immigration in China. So this is an overview of tonight's presentation. First, I'm going to cover some background and fundamentals. And then great discussion will be focused on work visa and work permits. And finally, I'm going to address several special issues. For example, exit ban, which is put in quotation mark, is something that is sounds mysterious and is understudied. And I'd like to make some contribution to shed some light on this issue. So those are the three main topics that I'm going to present. But before I go further, let me ask a rhetorical question. Why talk about immigration at this point? In fact, I have presented on many topics on China-related legal issues. But in my 20+ years legal professional life, this is the first time I devote a full-hour lecture on corporate immigration, because I think we are at a juncture, at a special moment. As I recall, 23 years ago, when I started my legal career, Chinese textiles, not people, Chinese textiles, garments, fabrics, clothing, to be exported to the US, a visa is required. So that is a visa for goods. But a few years later, when China joined the WTO, those kind of special barriers were gone. But 20 years later, China has become a major economy. In fact, a few days ago, if not yesterday, the US Congress has voted almost unanimously to declare China is no longer a developing country. And that is under the WTO rubric, because under WTO regime, you make a distinction between a developed country versus developing country for market access purpose. Is China really a developed country? I don't think any member of reading public in China would think China is a developed country, because as I can share you one data. This is again not from private sector. This is the data from last Chinese premier, I think last year or the year before. At the end of the Congress, People's Congress session, the premier mentioned that there are 600 million Chinese people earning less than $200 US dollars per month. So that was a shocking data. Many people were shocked, but that is a reality. So why is this relevant to immigration? Because I think immigration is a important aspect of global commerce. I have lived through the period when Chinese business owners have hard time to get US visa to do business in the US. Later on, when Ambassador Gary Locke was stationed in China, he personally, I think, made efforts to change the visa practice. So fortunately, right now, despite all the decoupling efforts from, well, there are decoupling efforts on many directions, mostly between US and China. So despite the tension between US and China, there is one good news on the visa front. The Chinese 10-year multi-entry visa granted to US citizens are still valid. It was suspended during COVID, 3-year COVID period, but it's resumed now. And the US still allows Chinese visa applicants to get 10-year multiple entry visa. So that is important news. It shows that the people's exchange, the people's link between the two great economies are still going strong. So let me, Aaron, next slide, please. So the larger background for tonight's presentation is the great question: is China reopening? Obviously, the word reopening refers to the fact that China has been closed, roughly closed, for 3 years. Let me give you data so you can understand why we consider China was effectively closed. In 2019, China has about 100 million foreigners in and out of China. 100 million foreigners in and out of China. This is before COVID. Year 2022, which is the last year, there were only 5 million foreigners in and out of China. So that was the drop from 100 million to 5 million in terms of immigration to China, short term mostly. So that is the significant extent of China has been closed. So now China is indeed reopening its door for commerce, for people's exchange, for cultural exchange. I don't want to repeat all these headlines, but I think one item I'd like to mention is that notwithstanding the huge demand of commerce and cultural exchange between US and China, the number of flights between US and China have not resumed to the level of pre-COVID. There is a geopolitical factor behind this situation, given the fact that Russia invaded Ukraine and under sanctions that US airlines could not travel to certain space that involving Russia space. Therefore, that the US authority requires, again, this is what I learned from the press, requires the Chinese airlines to follow the same route, which is, again, something Chinese authority may not agree to. So that impacts the flight availability between US and China. So all these factors is not a typical immigration lawyer would care about, but in fact, that's underlying conditions of immigration practice from China's perspective. The very first item headline on this page, the border between Hong Kong and the mainland is open now. Again, this is something remarkable. Certain people may not be aware of the fact, notwithstanding Hong Kong is part of China as far as international law is concerned, there is a border, and the border is strictly enforced between Hong Kong and the mainland. It was effectively closed during the COVID 3-year period, and now it's open. So that is very significant in terms of your measurement of whether China is open for business. And there are many other indications suggesting that China is indeed reopened for business. For example, you will see just in the recent, this particular week, there are quite a few CEOs of major multinational companies coming to China for a conference. In fact, several head of states are coming to China. French President Macron and the Brazil president is coming. Both of them are coming to China. So those are the reflection of the fact that China is making efforts to open for business. And with this background, let's focus on the corporate immigration reality that is unfolding as we speak. Aaron, please. Next slide. For any country or economy, immigration is a serious matter. So as you can imagine, China has a legal framework, legal structure to regulate immigration, especially corporate immigration. So I don't intend to go into great details of this legal structure, but I want to give you this foundational view of the major legal framework. So we have this exit and entry law of China, which was recently amended as of 2013. So this is 10 years after this statute. And under this law, we have this regulations, which is meant to implement this statute. And the last item, the rules for administration of employment of foreigners in China. So this is a rules promulgated and implemented by the Ministry of Human Resource and Social Security of People's Republic of China. So the reason I pick up these 3 examples, there are many other rules and regulations, but in fact, there is other statute relevant as well. But the reason I mentioned this 3, I want to give the audience a understanding that in China, you have this hierarchy of the statute, the regulation, and the department rule. So the first item here is a statute, is enacted by the People's Congress. The second one in the middle is called a regulation. So those are legal term. We have to read it as a legal term. So regulation in China is enacted by the Chinese cabinet, known as State Council. Again, that's a special term. Probably only in China we use that term to refer to cabinet. So regulations are enacted by State Council, and then each functional department, for example, this Ministry of Human Resource and Social Security would enact this regulation to regulate foreigners' employment. So that's called rules. So this is a typical Chinese administrative legal structure in the domain of corporate immigration, in the domain of foreigners coming in and out of China. So you have statute on the top, you have regulations, and you have department rules to really regulating daily practice. In fact, this exit and entry law dates back to 1986. That probably was the first statute after China opened up in the late 70s. So on average, about 8 years or 10 years or decade, there will be a major overhaul or major amendment of statutes. But as China's economy grows slower and slower, maybe it takes longer to amend a statute like this. In other words, the legal system is fairly mature and fairly established. In the future, going forward, it may take more than a decade to have a major amendment of a statute. Aaron, next slide, please. So we have this a chart of Chinese visa types. Our focus is not diplomatic visa, it's not official visa, it's not courtesy visa. Those are in the foreign policy, foreign affairs domain. Our focus is this ordinary visa. The regulatory body at the very top is State Council, as I mentioned, but in fact, State Council as a general collective body is not going to regulate these details. So it's the State Council would delegate its authority to specific ministries, specific offices, and we will study some of them in the next few slides. Aaron, next slide, please. Okay, here is the list of categories of ordinary visa. Like any country, you would have a tourism visa, you would have a visa for crew member. Those are not our focus. And we focus on a few relevant to corporate community. So the first one would be start with the English letter F, then M as Mary, R as Rose, and the very last one, Z as zebra. So those four categories are most relevant to the business community. They are quite straightforward in terms of each category covers what kind of activities. But as our presentation unfolds, you will see there are a lot of details that we will present on R visa and Z visa as they relate to foreigners' employment in China. Aaron, next slide, please. Again, China is a major economy, so it has a number of neighboring countries. It has a membership in APEC. So there are many diverse foreign international economic relationships under which visa or immigration is a important element. So you have mutual visa exemption agreements. You have special transit visa programs. In fact, if you are from Singapore, if you are from Japan, you get to travel to China without visa as a tourist. So those are great convenience. Some of this kind of special privileged visa waiver programs are not symmetrical. For example, Chinese nationals would have to get tourist visa to visit Singapore, but the other way around is not the case. Aaron, next slide, please. Here is a reciprocal visa agreement between US and China and between Canada and China. It's a reflection of importance of commerce between these countries with China. As I mentioned at the beginning of tonight's presentation, at least personally, I'm very glad, notwithstanding all the tension and the rivalries confrontations between US and China, this 10-year multiple visa program remains. For the duration of COVID lockdown in China, Chinese authorities suspended foreigners' 10-year multiple entry visa, and I'm glad to see that suspension was lifted in March this year. Aaron, next slide, please. Okay, now as you can see, I kind of rushed through the first few slides because those are what I refer to as the fundamentals, as a background. I think those are not our focus tonight. I would rather spend more time and discussion on work-related visa. This is something more complex, and it's difficult for many practitioners outside China to understand. So work visa, as you can see on this slide, we have two main categories. Well, the letter Z is the last English letter, but I put on top because this is more common. R visa is also a work visa, but has a name called foreign talent visa. And this is something, in terms of it comes to the reality, is a latecomer compared to Z visa. And very few people are qualified under this category. But it's something very interesting to watch, something very interesting to follow as it develops. I think R visa is fairly recent phenomenon. It reflects the reality that China is pursuing technology development. One pillar of that pursuit is to attract foreign talents and the so-called high-level talents. Aaron, next slide, please. But before I zoom in on Z visa and R visa, I'd like to quickly go through this so-called D visa, which is, to use colloquial term, is so-called Chinese green card, which refers to foreigners can get permanent residency in China with this D visa. So these are main conditions. One of the 7 conditions would be sufficient for the applicant to get the D visa. But do we know how many foreigners have been granted this D visa? Not to my knowledge. We don't have current, up-to-date, precise data. But I am aware of in the year between 2013 to 2015, 17, that was probably the first major wave of issuing of D visa. I saw a report indicating there were 7,000 foreigners were granted this D visa. In fact, this is for among the expat community, this is something highly sought after. Many foreigners have devoted their professional life in China, enjoyed the life here, participated in China's social and economic development. They would be very happy to have this permanent residency in China. But again, this is not my focus tonight. Aaron, next slide, please. Oh, by the way, before Aaron, can we move back to the last page, prior page? Yes. So I'd like to direct your attention to this number 7. So you see, this is a category that reflects the reality that there are some Chinese expats. You know, they used to be Chinese national citizens, and they, for work and study reason, they travel to outside China, become naturalized citizens of other countries. So some of them eventually feel they have a need to go back to China, and the foreign citizenship become a barrier. In other words, they couldn't afford, given their advanced age, they couldn't afford to travel back and forth in and out of China frequently under the foreign citizen status. So this is a kind of a special category of D visa. People under this category would, because of their connection, family connection with people in China, they would qualify for permanent residency in China, notwithstanding the fact they would otherwise not making any economic contribution to China. I point this out because I think this is an interesting category to indicate that visa policy reflects social values. I think this is a typical scenario where you see the Chinese culture's long-held tradition of respecting elders and make sure elders are taken care of is reflected in this visa policy. Aaron, next slide, please. Okay, here I listed a list. I doubt this is a complete list, but it's a fairly complete. It covers all the major regulatory agencies that are regulating corporate immigration in China. Obviously, you have to deal with Chinese embassies, consulates. Obviously, you have to, if you are performers, artistic performers, you probably need to get a certain paperwork from Ministry of Culture and Tourism. But certain other kind of offices are not something you would necessarily understand just by looking at the names or titles of this office. For example, State Administration of Foreign Exports Affairs. Not every country, to my knowledge, have this kind of office. For example, in the US, I know a little bit, you have an extraordinary aliens program granting extraordinary aliens permanent residency under US law. But I don't believe the US has a federal level agency regulating foreign experts. So this, again, is something very much reflective of China's as a national efforts to pursue foreign expertise. We will spend a few more slides on this very agency. Aaron, next slide, please. Okay, so here we kind of take a closer look at this State Administration of Foreign Exports Affairs. Well, as you can see, this agency recently is coming in and out of different ministries. So before April 2017, it was under Ministry of Human Resources and Social Security, and then as of April 2017, it's some sort of become a relatively independent. Well, independent is still under State Council, so it's not a ministry level agency, but it enjoys direct supervision from State Council. And then as of March 2018, it kind of got folded under Ministry of Science and Technology, although this particular name, State Administration of Foreign Exports Affairs, is retained. And as of this beginning of this month, today is almost the end of this month. The beginning of this month, China's recent Congress, People's Congress, has promulgated a new round of reshuffling of Chinese regulatory agencies, state councils structure. So as a result of this latest reform, this very important agency is back to a Ministry of Human Resources and Social Security. Aaron, next slide, please. So this is a overview of the process for foreigners obtaining work visa and related permits. Actually, I think probably this should be a plural, permits rather than permit. There are at least 2 permits that you need once you have a work visa and intend to work in China. So this, obviously, this is a very oversimplified flowchart. If anybody has run into work under this Chinese process of getting foreigners work visa, you would understand there are a lot of tedious work oversimplified by this process. So here, as you can see, the State Administration of Foreign Exports Affairs plays a very important role because initially this is almost the first step that you need to get a work permit notice. Again, this is an important legal distinction. The work permit notice is different from work permit. So notice is before you eventually get work visa, get work permit. So it's a notice. Essentially, it's a pre-approval. It's a notice to whom? Notice to the foreign station, the Chinese embassy staff. Essentially, the Chinese domestic regulatory agency, this Foreign Exports Affairs Bureau, sent a notice to Chinese Chinese embassy and or consulates that this particular foreign applicant is approved to be hired in China. So that is the next step. The Chinese embassy or consulate gets that notice and began to process work visa, Z visa or R visa. And then the applicant would be equipped with that work visa and coming to China and gets admitted into China, and then you apply for foreigners work permit. This work permit is issued once you are in China, and then this work permit is not enough. It's not the end of this process. You have to get a residency permit, and here you see the qualifier: work type or work-based, or you say employment-based resident permit. The reason that we use this qualifier is because residence permits have different variety. Some residence permit is based on family reunion. It has nothing to do with foreigners working in China. So the residence permit is something of a topic in itself. But here we emphasize you get work-based residence permit, and you deal with essentially local police bureau, which has a exit and entry control function. Aaron, next slide, please. So here we have a more detailed flowchart, essentially expanded version of the previous oversimplified process. Aaron, if you may, could you somehow enlarge this very detailed flowchart? Otherwise, probably some audience would have a difficult time to study this. Great, that's perfect. Yeah. Obviously, I don't intend that audience, really read every single letter or words here, but I want you to have a impression that actually this flowchart is not my work. It's directly copied from State Administration of Foreign Experts Affairs. It's a government commitment that this is the way they handle this kind of approval process. And you see, they committed to 10 working days, 5 working days. So this I can testify. If you have acceptable application package, a ready application package, the Chinese authorities processing time is as committed here. Is 5 working days, 10 working days. You rarely get something submitted and then they don't get back to you until 3 months later. It doesn't happen. So this is something quite remarkable. The bureaucratic efficiency is quite remarkable. But sometimes you run into troubles not after you submit the application package, rather at the beginning when you try to file, try to submit, because at that moment the government clerks will tell you, you missed this, you need that. So that is something very frustrating for foreigners, because sometimes, for example, you are told, hey, you need to bring a police clearance certificate. In some places called certificate of no criminal record. Well, you are away from your home country for a couple of years, and you have to contact your relatives, your classmates to get that document. So that kind of requirement sometimes can be very frustrating. But for major employers, this kind of requirement is common knowledge, and HR staff and outside counsel will tell you in advance this kind of documentation is needed. But I will come back to this kind of sometimes a very demanding documentation requirement because things are changing. That's why I think we are doing a reality check. There are certain things are changing for the better. Aaron? Oh, by the way, before we move to this stage, I want to report to you that the government is committed to streamline the application processing process. There are a few numbers taken toward that objective. For example, the government would say for our visa applicants, you are allowed to file your entire package online. That means you don't have to submit your original passports. You use PDF copy of your passports that will be accepted. And also there are mechanisms allow you to say, well, I know this document is needed, but at this moment I don't have it, but allow my application to move forward, and I will come back with the document when I pick up the issued finally approve the papers. So that kind of a mechanism help the foreign expat community to move things along quickly, and the government is taking this kind of measures. Again, it's part of not just post-COVID. It has been the general process to improve the administrative efficiency. And then there's another major news I would like to share with the corporate immigration community. In the past 40 years, as China opened up to international economy, people have always been frustrated by the fact that sometimes you have to get your documents notarized and then legalized by the Chinese consulate or embassy in the foreign country. And otherwise, those documents would not be acceptable in China. Chinese government, Chinese courts would demand the documents must be legalized. So legalizing documents, public documents, typically takes 2 or 3 months if you are lucky and you get things done right in the first run. So that is the reality for 40 years, at least, since 1978. But this year we have a major development. China has decided to join this major Hague Convention, which allows public documents to be accepted in China without that consulate legalization process. So this convention is commonly known as Apostille Convention. This is a great step forward. It's a great news for corporate business community, immigration, and other professionals would be very happy to see this new reality. But again, just to mention, this ratification process is ongoing. My knowledge is that it won't become effective probably until the beginning of next year. Okay, Aaron, thanks for the next slide. Okay, now we are really zooming in on this somewhat mysterious R visa. To understand what is a high-level foreign talents, again, this is a legal category in terms of corporate immigration to China. So high-level foreign talents, sometimes you may translate as a high-end foreign talents. There is 2 ways to look at this. The first way is what I presented here. So you need to understand the next concept, the Class A. The Class A was initially defined under Z visa, but it's also a criterion that used to define what is R visa applicants should be. So this is 6 different criteria that you can qualify under. You don't have to meet all the 6 criteria, of course. So this is one of this would be enough. So for example, if you are well, the first category is something it's not straightforward. It's not intuitively clear. The second category is very straightforward. So if you are a former minister of a country, well, you qualify under R visa. If you are a Nobel laureate, you are qualified under this R visa. You are by definition high-level foreign talent. But interestingly, there are some other way that you can get qualified. For example, if you are a key soccer player and you get employed by a Chinese national team or even sometimes a professional team, and that makes you a high-level foreign talent. It's fairly easy for me to present this conceptual definition of this foreign high-level talent. But in reality, as you can imagine, there are all walks of life. People earn their distinctions, and exactly what is the high level, that's a nightmare for a bureaucratic process. But the Chinese bureaucrats have marched on and developed a very detailed catalogs, lists, standards, guidelines to manage this process. So that brings us to the first category. So if you are accepted by various talent recruitment programs, and you are a Class A foreign talent. So what is talent recruitment programs? If you follow American press, you understand, you probably learned this 1,000 talent. That's the top tier, the best among the best. So that is a well-known talent recruitment program. But in fact, there are different other talent recruit programs. Almost every Chinese province would create a program like that. Probably every major ministry of China have a program to seek high-level foreign talents. But again, if you are coming from nowhere, you say, I run a program seeking a recruitment of foreign talents, you probably won't get passed because which organization, which entity run this talent recruitment program is very important. It needs to be certified by the competent government authority. Let's move to next slide, Aaron. So as we mentioned at the beginning, work visa typically divided to 3 types of categories. So we discussed Class A, and now we discuss Class B and Class C. So Class C is so-called miscellaneous, is the general pool. Class B is something in the middle, it's so-called professionals, but there is a detailed definition of what is a professional. So typically it's a bachelor degree or higher, and then you have 2 years related work experience. So if you study computer science, get a master degree, but you have only 2 years work experience as a bartender, that's not good. So related work experience plus the certain level of higher education. And of course, most corporate immigration stakeholders are major or middle-level multinational companies, and the Chinese system welcomes multinational companies investing in China. So doors are open to those intra-company transferees, to borrow an American term. So those companies with investment in China, with subsidiaries in China, typically have very little trouble to dispatch or second their managers to China. Under Class A and Class B, you see I mentioned having certain number of points. So under Class A, I believe is 85 points. Here, Class B is having at least 60 points. So what are the points? What are we talking about? I think not China. Many countries have this kind of point system. Aaron, next slide, please. So China has recently developed this points regime, which is used to use numerical system to quantitatively measure up the foreign talents, whether they are good enough for China's work visa. So the list here are the factors under this regime. Each factor has different weight measured by the points. I don't think we have the need to go into that great details, but you can see here, it's a fairly common sense, and probably each country have come up with pretty much the same. But there are 2 things I think is worth mentioning. One, toward the end of the list, first, China has a fetish of world-renowned university degrees, and anybody who have Fortune 500 work experience. I don't see other countries necessarily cares this kind of experience as much as Chinese system does. And the very last one, endorsement from local government. Well, this is something where you get murky, and local government endorsement come into various shape and form. But fortunately, there are only a certain number of points you can earn under this category. But this is a very flexible factor that can be manipulated. And as you can imagine, under any system like this, there are potential corruption or misrepresentation. I think China is no exception in that regard. Aaron, next one, please. So now we have 15 minutes to go. I think our timing is all right. So we start to discuss a few special issues, as I promised at the beginning. So the first one is what I put under quotation mark, exit ban. This is something, again, from my vantage point, I noticed that the press in the US, mostly in the UK, has been reporting some very sensational headline grabbing stories about the foreigners get somewhat restricted in China. They couldn't move out China. And they are not detained. They are not criminally detained. They can move around in China, but they are not allowed to leave China. So this exit ban seems to be mysterious, seems to be very opaque. I would second that. It's not something ordinary people know. If you don't study this, if you don't practice this, you have a hard time to understand how it works. But my point here is that this is not something totally outside of a legal regime. It is indeed very not straightforward, and the general public have a hard time to understand how it works. But it's not without the legal constraints. So here I recited about 6 not statutes. Some are statutes, some are judicial interpretations, some are departmental rules. But you can see here, there are high-level statutes, basic statutes such as civil procedure law. You have high-level judicial interpretation, which is from the Chinese highest court. You also have instructions, rules from Chinese top prosecutor's office. So all these different stakeholders in terms of government agencies are trying to put limits on this exit bans. And there are different scenarios that people are subject to exit ban, not just foreigners. And Chinese citizens are subject to exit ban as well. But for our purpose, we focus on why certain foreigners are subject to exit ban, and they are not criminally, in any sense, they are not criminally charged or implicated. So they are common business people, and why they are subject to exit ban. A common scenario is, again, is expressly provided by the statute, by the rules and the interpretations. A common scenario is that these foreigners are implicated in civil commercial dispute court proceedings. So the common phrase is that if there is a civil lawsuit that is not finally disposed, in other words, the case is still active, and if that particular foreigner is important to the result, to the enforcement of the final ruling of the case, and that kind of person are potentially subject to exit ban. It's not just any plaintiff can put any potential defendants related foreigners under this ban. You have to meet criteria. You have passed quite a few hoops in order to get this ban. In fact, sometimes you won't be able to get it, even you try hard. So there is a very elaborate procedures to make this happen. What I presented here is only a few recent highly accessible statutes or regulations and judicial interpretations. In fact, this exit bans from legal perspective, from legal research perspective, started in mid-1980s. Some of the rules dates back to mid-1980s, are still relevant, are still effective. So as you can see, this is an ongoing, evolving regime, legal regime, and the system is struggling to make this, in one sense, effective for its intended public policy purpose. For in another sense, to prevent this kind of measure from being abused. So I think this exit ban remain something worth following as we move into a new era of China's interaction with global community. Aaron, oh, by the way, before I move on, I think we can stay here. If some foreigner is implicated by this exit ban, it does not necessarily mean you have no way to counteract to that. For example, you could post a bond. For example, if you have a commercial dispute and what plaintiff is asking is 100,000 RMB, then you could post an effective bond to release yourself from that exit ban. Okay, Aaron, next slide, please. Well, it's common and fair to hear complaints from outside world that Chinese immigration system is quite complex, and sometimes you would say it's more than just being complex, it's opaque. Well, there is a difference between complexity and opaqueness. Complexity could be because the intellectual issues are complex, but opaque, typically is considered as the opposite of being transparent. It's not a good thing to have a legal system that is opaque. It's not fair to people navigating under an opaque system. So I'm not here to make a judgment. I leave this to the audience, to the general public, to whoever interacts with the Chinese immigration system to make that judgment on whether it's opaque or complex or both. That's not the real issue driving this discussion. But I would like to essentially share my journey of getting to know this system. I think looking back of my 20-year experience of dealing with the system, I realized that I initially underestimated the diversity of China as an economy, as a nation, as a country. Whatever you see in Shanghai, you cannot assume that is the same 300 miles off Shanghai or even 3,000 kilometers off Shanghai. So the diversity is immense. And in the same 40 years, while the diversity remains, there is a dynamic process. The Chinese economy probably grew by 35 times in 40 years. And all these are under a centralized system from everything, almost everything major is decided in Beijing. So this is a quite remarkable setup. On the one hand, there is a one line of communication, one line of command and control. And on the other hand, there is a diverse realities. And then from time perspective, there is a dynamic progress and change and the evolution. So with that kind of a background, you see this Chinese system develop its own way of handling this kind of contradiction and challenge. For example, let me just point at Office of Foreign Affairs. So the second in the list. So Office of Foreign Affairs, this is not a sister or brother of Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs. This is a purely local office. It's under local government, under local provincial government, under local municipal government. They are not answerable to Chinese Foreign Ministry, notwithstanding the name. Why would the Chinese system need this local office, governmental office, in charge of foreign affairs? Again, if you look at American system, you generally get understanding, well, it's a federal system, diplomacy is a domain under federal government, and the state department should, state government should not have foreign policy. Here in China, I'm not saying Chinese province has its own foreign policy, but the point is that there are a lot of foreign affairs that needs to be dealt with locally. And Shanghai's foreign affairs approach and the policy and the issues may be very different from an inland province. So that is the challenge and the issues that the Chinese local office of foreign affairs deal with. For example, during the COVID period, if you want to invite foreigners coming to China, the local office of foreign affairs have to issue a special invitation letter. This is not pro forma invitation letter. This is a letter with Chinese government stamp, which is issued by the Office of Foreign Affairs. So this local office has the expertise, has the in-depth understanding of local needs, local economic development needs, to make a judgment of whether this particular foreigner is the right person to be invited to China, notwithstanding the general lockdowns. So this kind of policy decisions is handled very locally. Similarly, Commerce Bureau, Commerce Commission sounds like, this is about economy, this is about business, but they sometimes play a role in issuing visa-related paperwork. Because again, this is another point I want to highlight. The Chinese corporate immigration system has a very important policy objective, which is to support China's economic development and especially tech development. So let's move to the next point, not next slide. So Chinese immigration, still on this page. So if you deal with China's corporate immigration system, you will get a strong impression. It's very much tech-oriented. The policy objective is very clear, is to advance Chinese technology, which is in turn advancing Chinese economic development. And also the system is tech-enabled. That's why you get 5-day processing time, 10-day processing time, because it's underwritten, under-supported by the high-tech system. And then the government now is very efficient in terms of allowing data being shared almost in real time among different agencies. Remember in the previous slide, I mentioned quite a few government agencies, and now they share data almost in real time. And then there's another tech-enabled system, which is heavily reported in the Western media, is social credit system. So foreigners coming to China, your conducts, to the extent whether you follow Chinese immigration law or not, it's going to be recorded under the social credit system, and you will bear consequence to that. So that again are something new in recent years. The next point is discretion for better or worse. So this again is I think is a major factor behind this Chinese opaque system, because many things are not written into laws or regulations. They are not even posted online or in the office. And the government is essentially making their decisions without telling you the explicit rules they are relying on. So for many countries who have very much more transparent legal system, and people get frustrated, this is not a rule of law, this is opaque. Maybe there is a fair point to that kind of critique, but I would say, well, there is another side to look at. This is what I say, discretion. For better or worse, it's not you and me to judge, because there's different perspective. But I don't have much time to give a in-depth study of Chinese officials' discretion in handling corporate immigration. But here, next slide, please, Aaron. I want to share a very interesting recent news from Singapore. So I use this title, Learning from Singapore. And it happens to be about immigration. And it happens to be a very transparent parliamentary hearing session. Essentially, the deputy minister in charge of home affairs, which is immigration affairs, are being questioned by parliaments. And the issue at stake is why the rules about naturalization to become Singapore citizens are not posted. The rules are not transparent, and there is a specific response to that questions. I don't want to bore you to read this, but the point is that the government officials saying that given the unique cultural and geographic status situation of Singapore, and given their sensitivity to prevent their naturalization process being abused by people who game the system, they intentionally decide not to have a publicized rules governing this naturalization process. Well, this is Singapore is a well-governed country. It has a rule of law system with British heritage. So you cannot say Singapore is not a rule of law place, but the official here openly stated the policy reason behind their discretion not to have a transparent rules, because there is certain significance or sensitivity to that. Aaron, next slide, please. So this is what the minister told the parliament members. In fact, she made a fine distinction between general immigration rules versus citizen rules. And the citizen rules goes to the demographic makeup and the social fabric over the long term, while the foreign general employment is something of minor significance. So it shows the fine thinking on the part of this minister or their staff. Next, which is the final page. Aaron, please. Well, I'm about to wrap up my presentation, but I haven't really introduced my firm. So I think this would be the moment to introduce my firm. It so happens that the two words, English words here, are fairly easy to pronounce. They are not partners' names. They are trade names, Long and it's fairly easy, but they are not English word long or particle connector word and. So they are two Chinese characters. The English meaning, the meaning of these two characters happens to be prosperity, peace, safety, and wellness. And I hope I can end this presentation with this English concept of prosperity and peace. In fact, this is a mantra of my firm. And we had this mantra dates back early 1990s, when China was at an important moment, began to experiment a market economy. And the Chinese first group of law firms, among which Long An is one of that early law firms, began the journey of growth. So this year we are 30-year-old, and we are well positioned to participate in the globalization in the next 30 years. So this is the moment to end my presentation, but I hope there are some questions I can entertain. Dan?
Hi, Frank. Thank you very much for that incredibly informative webinar and a little bit about your law firm at the end there. Thank you very much, Frank. Looking at the time, I think we have time for just one question, maybe two. So if I understand it correctly, Frank, Class A talents may apply for Z visa or R visa. What is the difference between these two types? If someone is Class A caliber, how would that person choose Z versus R?
Oh, great question. I think I should have mentioned that Z visa by design is a transition visa. It lasts only 30 days. It's meant for a foreign applicant to hold that visa, come into China, settle down in China, and by having work permit and a resident permit. And our visa is different. People are qualified under Class A, but they don't intend to come to China to work. For example, a professor in Harvard may have our visa and travel in and out China fairly conveniently, but they have no need, the person has no need to settle down in China. So there's no need for him or her to get Z visa. So that R visa is more privileged and convenient for that person. So this is a very important clarification. I'm glad someone asked.
Excellent, that makes complete sense. Thank you, Frank. And I think we have time for just one more. Given the importance of the State Administration of Foreign Expert Affairs, how would you read the fact that this agency was just moved out of the Ministry of Science and Technology and back to the Ministry of Human Resources and Social Securities?
Well, yes, this is a remarkable development because a few years ago they were put into under the Science and Technology Ministry. And my reading is that, but this opens to another topic beyond today's conversation. I think the reason because China, under this newly restructured Science and Technology Ministry, intends to do certain things that are beyond the importance of attracting foreign talents. In other words, the new China Technology and Science Ministry is aiming something much more significant than managing routine foreign talents in tech field. So this is the only indication of China's ambition of a new Science and Tech Ministry. It doesn't reflect the fact that this administration is underestimated. So that would be my reading.
Excellent, thank you, Frank. And I think that is all we have time for, but a perfect place to end today's webinar. So thank you again, Frank, for your expertise today. We really do appreciate it and hope we can invite you back in the future for another webinar. I'd like to thank our audience as well for being with us today. We really do appreciate it. It's been a real pleasure to have you with us. Frank, I'll hand over to you for any closing comments before we finish today.
Well, again, I enjoyed this session very much, and I thank you and your staff for this great technical work to make this happen.
Frank, it's been a real pleasure to have you and to work with you, and we look forward to seeing you again.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.